I guess I'll do it that way. Welcome to Italian Roots and Genealogy, where history lives in our blood. We explore the journeys, records, and family stories that connect Italy to the world. Because when you discover your roots, you don't just find names, you find yourself. And be sure to check out our YouTube channel and our blog and our newsletter and our great sponsor. And my guest today is Brian Schneider, who runs My Ancestral Italy. So welcome, Brian. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Good to be here today.
So Schneider's not an Italian name, so I'm assuming it must be mom, yeah?
Actually, my wife. Um,
Okay.
so yeah, I'm pretty much all Germanic on my father and my mother's side. My wife, it's the reason we live in Italy. Her paternal nonna was from Basilicata, and so that's what actually brought us to Italy. We currently live in Le Marche, Ascoli Piceno, but we've bought a house and we lived in Basilicata for, boy, almost 12, 13 years. So, and it
Oh,
was very,
that's really neat. I just assumed that it was your mom, but that's
okay.
I wish I knew years ago what I know now. I would have had at least a vacation place there, if nothing else. So what made you move there? I mean, had to be something, yeah.
Well, we first came for a visit back in the 90s, so that's a long time ago. And I never really had a big desire to come to Italy. My wife did because she grew up, listening to her grandmother speaking, which would have been the local dialect, and cooking in the kitchen. So she always had a desire to come to visit Italy, which we did. Yeah, I think in 1998, and my in-laws were here over in Gaeta, and so we had somewhere we could come and stay and somebody to visit, tour guides built in. And actually, after that first visit, we were both hooked. This was the type of lifestyle that was going to be better for us and fit more what our focus was on life and our values. So then we started coming. We came actually three other times, and each time we would come and spend a little more time, spend a week, maybe 10 days, stay in one place, not be tourists, try and see what it was like to actually live here, because living is different than visiting. What's it like to go get a haircut? What's it like to go buy something from the ferramenta that you need for the house? When are the stores open? When are the stores closed? You're in smaller towns, things close down during the middle of the day. So there's different focus on life and different timetable on how things happen. Then we eventually decided, we'd like to move here, but it was difficult. How do you just pick up your life and find a job in another country? And we tried that for a while, but didn't work out. Uh, you have to have certain skills to be able to get a job in Italy, to get somebody to want to hire you, unless you have the means to support yourselves. And we eventually got to the point where 20 years ago in May, we decided we were just going to sell our house in Albuquerque and do what we could to come to Italy for at least a year. And so we made that happen, sold our house, set aside a certain amount of funds to have a year in Italy. All the paperwork that was involved with that was back before internet, and you had to do things by phone calls and bank transfers and all that fun stuff. And so we ended up moving to Italy. We stayed in Anzio, south of Rome. We had very good Roman friends who had a summer house down there that we could stay. And we went there. And once we were there, we started looking at wanted to go to a language school to get better with the language. We had taken some classes in Albuquerque. My wife has a very good ear for the language because she heard it when she was a child. For me, it's a little more difficult. But we searched around for language schools where we would not hear English everywhere once we left school. Because, like, if you go to Firenze, you go to a restaurant, they speak to you in English. In Roma, they speak to you in English in the restaurants. We found a place here in Ascoli Piceno, which is in La Marche on the Adriatic coast. And we came here for school for 2 weeks. We like to call it our language boot camp because it was, 4 to 6 hours a day, classes and then some homework, and then you go out in the evenings and do some activities. And everybody around us spoke Italian, so it was kind of do or die. And we actually ended up then moving to Ascoli. We lived here for about 2.5 years. And while we were here, we started making trips down to Basilicata, where my wife's family originated from. The town is called Anzi, which is south of Potenza. Anzi and Lorenzana is where her ancestors came from. So we actually found a third cousin that she still has in Anzi. So we go down there and connect with them, go to some of the festivals. We eventually realized it was an area we really liked. Reminded us of New Mexico, a lot of mountains, kind of not the tourist areas. This was before Matera became a big thing back in 2009, 2010. And we found a small town near Anzi, a town called Trevino. And we were staying there at a agriturismo just outside of town and talking to the owners, saying, hey, we'd be interested in finding a place to live because we'd actually been looking for almost 2 years if we could find a house that we could buy. So the owners of this agriturismo put us in touch with the mayor of this town. Trevino is a town at that time had maybe 700 people. And he, being the mayor, he knew who everybody was. He knew all the properties. He actually had keys to certain houses because he's actually also a civil engineer and he does construction refurbishment projects. So we spent some time with him and we actually went around, looked at several different houses, found a place that needed minimal work that we could then move in. The owner, the owners had passed away, and the daughter who was then inherited the property, she lived in Rome. And so we had talked to her on the phone and talked about price. And the thing is, in some of these small towns, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, you could buy a house for the price of a pickup truck in the United States. And so we were like, okay, even if this wasn't somewhere where we were going to live all the time, it's not an opportunity we could pass up, somewhere we could always come and stay. So we actually were on our way moving back to the States for a year because we're like, okay, we need to get back to the States, get some things sorted out. We met her in Rome the day before we flew out, agreed on a price with a handshake, and we talked about, okay, do we need to give you money or anything? So no, I need to figure out some of the paperwork. I need to finish up the inheritance, transfer some things to the notaio. We'll take care of it all over by phone. It's no problem. So then within the next year, everything went through. My wife flew back to Rome to do the meeting with the notaio, sign all the paperwork, and we then had a property. And that actually became something that was featured on House Hunters International
Oh, wow.
back in 2011. Yeah.
That's really cool. Now I'm going to have to go search for that. That takes a lot of guts to just do all of that. But I guess, go back to what you mentioned about the language, I guess that's probably the way to do it, right? Is just be fully immersed. Yeah.
Correct. And at the town we lived in down in Basilicata, nobody speaks English. So you learn to speak Italian, and there pretty much everybody speaks dialect. They speak the local dialect. They speak Napolitano. Some will speak Bariese. Some will speak, different dialects, and then Italian. So frequently we'd be talking to someone and we'd have to remind them, please, you need to speak Italian because we do not understand all the dialects.
Well, I was this a few years ago now. I was actually offered a home in one of my ancestral towns, but it was, it's like on the top of a mountain in Calabria. And just driving there from Reggio Calabria through these winding hills and all of that kind of, but I thought he was kidding. And they said, no, he's serious. You could have this house. It was like I don't know, a 2 or 3 bedroom house or something like that. But it needed work. But he said, I'll help you do all of that and everything. It was a really nice gesture. But if it was 20 years ago, I probably would have said, yeah. But,
Okay.
70 something is a little tough to jump into that, especially, going up the mountains and all of that kind of stuff. It would have been rough. But I have a friend who she moved there, I guess I think close to 7 years now. And it was the same thing. I mean, she knew some Italian, but she said the same thing. She said, she said, even now, she says there's still things that, are tough for her to get across in Italian. And I guess it takes a lot of practice.
Well, the language you learn in Italian language school is different than the language they use every day. And that was one of the first things we learned. 'Cause, we took language Italian lessons in the US and then came here and did language lessons. But then you go out to the bar and, the way they ask you what you want, the way you ask for something is different than what they teach you in the book. So there are things that are different, and there's differences across the country. The language they use in Basilicata is different than the language they use here where we are now in Le Marche. My wife and I were just talking about this at lunch today, because down in the south in the Basilicata, it's all formal. A lot of voi, and even essi and egli. We're here in central Italy, it's lei, second person. So the way the language is used and pronunciations, it definitely varies. It's not one unified language.
And that's interesting. We have Italian lessons at the club. It's only once a week, and it's more fun than anything than we're actually learning Italian. But our teacher, he talked about that, and he said in certain, he said if you go to the doctor, or it's not, he said, or a professional, you never use the familiar unless they tell you, well, it's okay to use that. But that's interesting that not that far away. They go from the formal to the familiar.
Even like you said with the doctor, here in La Marche, we went to see an eye doctor yesterday, and speaking with her, we used lei. But down south in Basilicata, if you meet with the doctor, you would use voi. So they use the formal plural, where in the central Italy, they use the formal singular. So, I mean, it's little things like that that you don't learn. And the first time you hear it, you're like, who are they talking to? I don't understand why they're using a different pronoun.
The other thing that struck me very, very interesting, and I wish I knew it before when I was there a couple of times, was I guess I think it's when you enter someone's home, you're supposed to say prossimo.
Or permesso.
Permesso. Right. Yeah, that's
Correct.
right. Permesso, which was very, very interesting. And he said, it's just done, it's just the way it's done.
You say permesso and wipe your feet.
I wish I knew that, because we went into somebody's home and I didn't know that. But he wasn't actually, he just told us, this was in that same town. He told us just go in, because that was the only place to go to the bathroom.
Okay. That's important.
So he just told us to go into his home, which was really, really very, very nice. So where did your wife grow up in the States, in the Italian family?
Well, she grew up in a small town called Bellevue, Ohio, which is over by Toledo. It's about halfway between Toledo and Cleveland. So her ancestors, obviously arrived in New York early 1900s. 3, I believe. And then her branch of the family, her whole family came from Basilicata. So it was a group. One of the siblings stayed in Basilicata. So they all came over to New York eventually. Her grandmother, her great-grandmother, and her grandmother then migrated to Ohio. They were following the railroad jobs and the quarry jobs in Ohio. So that's where they settled. Small town, it's maybe 2,000 people, but there's a big railroad hub right there. And that's kind of where they settled down.
And, there weren't a lot of people that came from Basilicata, but I guess, so like you said, one person came and then the rest of the family came and all of that. And they came, if they came turn it essentially, they came pretty early then too.
Yeah, they actually had some family members that had come over like 1897, the first ones, but then her direct ancestors like 1902. And it's the type of thing, the campanile, where the families, the towns, attract each other to a certain location. Like in the US, once you get out of New York, people from different towns would go, like from San Fele, Basilicata, the hometown of Danny DeVito's family. They all went to Upper New York State, to the same town. Certain towns, they went to St. Louis, my wife's family, they actually originally went to Cleveland, and then they ended up in the small town out in Western Ohio. So, because there was with dialect, when her ancestors left Italy, they did not speak Italian. They spoke a dialect. And so they had to go somewhere where they understood the customs and they could communicate with the same dialect, especially in Basilicata. Um, Basilicata has 131 comune, which are separate towns and cities. There are 90 separate distinct dialects. So you go from one town to another and they're speaking a different language. So it made a difference as to where you would then emigrate to, whether it was in North America or South America. So that was a big deciding factor.
Yeah, and growing up, I always thought my grandparents, I always thought they were speaking Italian, but they weren't. They were speaking Barese. And it wasn't until a few years ago somebody sent me something, one of the festivals just before Christmas in Torito, where they came from. And this man was walking down the street making this announcement very loud. And as soon as I heard that, I said, that's what I heard. That's what I remember. That's the sound I remember hearing.
Yes.
And it wasn't, like you said, it wasn't Italian. And in Calabria, they were singing this song, Mangiagrappa, right? And it's just a couple of chords on the guitar. So I asked them, I said, well, could you send me I figured that out. I said, could you send me the lyrics? So they sent me the lyrics, and it was like nothing I ever saw before. It was almost like Greek,
Yes.
It was English letters, but they were like a string of consonants, like you wouldn't believe. Maybe a vowel shoved in here once in a while.
Well, that's the thing about living in a small town. We had to learn some of the dialect words just, for like, how do you say salsicha? They would say salsich, and how they would pronounce different things. There was a dialect word for that. And so when somebody would say something to you and they would use the dialect, you had to be able to understand what they were actually talking about. So yeah, it's important. And the neat thing is, in a lot of these smaller towns, I mean, they're still teaching dialect at home. I mean, that's what they speak at home is dialect. They learn Italian in school. They speak dialect at home, and then when they go off somewhere else, they may pick up another language. Because in the schools, it's interesting now. Every language, every level of school, from kindergarten to college, they are taught English, but they cannot pronounce it very well unless they actually hear somebody speaking native tongue English, because the pronunciation of vowels and words is different in Italian than it is in English. A lot of the teachers that are teaching English in Italy in some of these smaller areas have no background speaking mother tongue English, so they're pronouncing everything with a vowel at the end. So there's differences there too.
Yeah, the guys are talking about that's what the guys are talking about in Long Branch here in New Jersey, where they were making, their grandparents are making English words into Italian, But that's the other interesting thing is where with us, the vowel sounds change. In Italy, the vowel sound is always the same. And that's,
Correct.
then you understand why when they pronounce certain things, it doesn't sound right to us, but to them, it makes sense. I'm always embarrassed to say my name over there in Italy because I say Sorrentino and it's Sorrentino.
Sorrentino.
Sounds a
Right.
lot nicer when it's,
Yeah,
it has that melodic kind of ring to it,
the I and the E are two big ones that catch people because they're pronounced differently in English than they are in Italian.
Well, yeah. Those of us in the class who, I mean, in our club, there are actually, people who don't pronounce their name even close. And they always refer, we have one of our members is, his last name is DeFilia. And every time somebody gets up there at the mic, they say DeFiglia. And we're all go like,
Yes.
So what got you started with doing the ancestry?
Well, my wife, back when we lived in Albuquerque, she started looking into her ancestry. This was back when they didn't have internet. She would go to the Mormon Church's Family Research Center in Albuquerque, request the microfilm discs. They would come and she would then have to go to the center and she'd look through them at the microphone or microfiche viewer. So she found out some of her background, and we learned that the family came from Basilicata, these two small towns, Anzi and Lorenzana, in the mountains of Basilicata. Um, and then when we moved here, she had a blog. This was back before Facebook and Instagram, and blogs were the thing. And she would put our story on there, what we were doing, and people started writing to her saying, I've got ancestors that came from that area, because Basilicata had a lot of people, not as many as Campania, Calabria, and Sicilia, because smaller population, but they had a large percentage of the people that left and went to the United States. So a lot of people began writing to her through her blog saying, how can I find out information about my ancestors, because I can't get the records here. So we started going to the different comune and actually looking at the records in the comune offices, going to the Archivio di Stato in Potenza, looking at records. Then we finally decided, hey, we're getting enough of this. Let's make it a business and put some effort into this. And we were kind of doing it 50. We'd go to the towns together and looking at the records. And you have to learn to read the script, because the Italian script is much different than English script, especially the way they write numbers. And in these older records, you'd have to learn how to write them. You go into the offices and you might ask the official in the office, what's this record say? And they're like, I don't know. So you'd have to learn out how to read the different scripts. And so we started doing that, developing people that wanted to have records found and set up the website, trying to get that publicized, did some things, local TV in Basilicata, but that was always in Italian, so it didn't help much with English-speaking audiences. And a lot of it became word of mouth. Facebook then became more popular, and the demographics of Facebook fit pretty well with our demographics of our clients, age group, educational background, financial situation. And we started out doing just Basilicata. Then we started doing Basilicata in Campania and Puglia. Then a couple years ago, we relocated to Le Marche in central Italy, and that's when we switched it to my ancestral Italy, where we can cover pretty much the whole country, because now pretty much all of the records are online. I mean, there's certain areas where they're not. You can access pretty much everything online.
Yeah, I mean, they've done a fantastic job with that kind of stuff. My mom's town, Torito. I mean, when I started researching there, it's probably 6 or 7 years ago. I mean, they must have been one of the early ones, because all the records going back to 1806 or 1809 are there. My dad's family in Naples was very difficult, although I didn't know at the time. They always said they were from Naples. I later found out that my grandmother was born in Turcola and my grandfather was born in Pagani. That makes a big difference when people are out there trying to search things and looking at Naples, and they're not from Naples. They may be near Naples, but they're not from Naples.
And that's very common, especially in the South. It's like, people ask me, where am I from? I would say Cleveland. Well, I never lived in Cleveland. I lived in Stowe, which is down near Akron. But you mentioned, what's the largest town where you grew up? And it's very common, especially in southern Italy and especially in Basilicata. So people say from Anzi, the town where my wife's family came from, they would not tell somebody that they're from Anzi. They would say they're from Potenza, which is the province. And so that's where it gets complicated, especially with Naples, because Naples is a big city itself, and it's got a lot of towns around there. So people would say, yeah, I'm from Naples. Their family was from Naples, but yeah, they're from a small town, or maybe they're from one of the quartieri within Naples, which then makes it more difficult trying to pin down where the records are. Because, in Naples, even in a quartiere, there may have been 500 births any one year. So trying to find the name can become very difficult.
Yeah, and I tell people too, when they're searching the Antonati, I said, they have a lot of different people indexing it, and you gotta kind of try variations on the name. Like my second great grandmother was from Switzerland. Her last name was Mohr, Mohr, and they have her under that. There's some under there, but then there's also under Moeller, Mollar. And, I kind of just stumbled on that. So people have to don't give up, I guess, is the answer. Try something else, try a little variation. If you think it's an O, it might be an A at the end, or it may be an A in the middle when it's supposed to be an O, or things like that. I always have the guy, when I look at my records, I always have the guy who writes like me. I don't have the guy who writes really, really nice.
Yeah, and that's the problem. I mean, deciphering the script is part of the problem of when you're trying to read the records. And another thing, especially if it can even be an Italian surname when they go from one town to another. It's how they pronounce it, and what's the common name for that town might be different than. So is it Sorrentino, or is it Sorrentina, or is it Sorrentini? And that can vary based on the town, what name is familiar in that town if somebody's moved. And especially if it's a non-Italian name, how did they pronounce the name that was spelled differently? Because, if you say a name a certain way, Italians are used to writing the name exactly the way they hear it. Where in English, we spell things differently than the way they're pronounced. So those are the things people have to remember.
Well, and my cousins that they grew up in Bari, or Torito, they were the last ones to come. They didn't come until the 50s. They told me, when they would go to Comune to give the birth of one of the kids, they said, sometimes, our 10-year-old brother would go or something like that. So, anything could happen. It could give the birthday wrong, or the name of the parent wrong, or they heard him wrong, like you said, or something like that. Yeah, it's I mean, I've learned, and I tell people too, I said, once you start doing it, you pick up on the terminology. You're able to kind of read the record. The later ones where they had the pre-printed books, a
Yes.
little easier than the ones from the early 1800s, which, you really got to study some of those.
Yes. Like I said, the script can be very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you look at a series of records and it's one person that's writing, you get familiar with that script, and then the next one you look for, they changed.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I said, I always have the guy who writes like me, which is terrible, but it's fascinating to do that. And I've interviewed a couple of people who they built an index for their entire town. I have to give them credit for that. They've looked at every single record and indexed it and found, cousins and things like that. Like they say in these records, sometimes it's a cousin might be the witness, or the next door neighbor might be a witness, or things like that, because it was such a close-knit society, right?
Yeah. Yeah, everybody knew everybody else. Some of these towns you go into and people want to know, okay, where did the family live? Well, in some towns on the records, they didn't put a street. They would just say, they lived in town in their proprio casa, in their house, because everybody knew where everybody else lived. Everybody knew who everybody was.
Well, that's so interesting. That's
Yeah.
interesting that they would just say, yeah, why, right? Because they know where they know down the block. Well, I always say that, when I speak to the Italians, because they don't do like DNA, and they don't do a lot of ancestry research and things like that. But the cemetery is right down the block, and the whole family's probably in there, so they know where everybody is, and they know.
On it, as saying Italians here, because we get a lot of times people are like, oh, trying to find relatives can be difficult if you're needing to connect, say, with a third or fourth cousin. Because Italians frequently, they know the family that they probably met. So their grandparents and their great grandparents. If you start asking them about, their great great grandparents, his bisnoni, they're like, I don't know. I mean, we've been into towns where we're asking about, looking for records, and it's always a good thing to go ask the old guys sitting out in the piazza, because they probably know everything. So you go up to and you ask them, and you're like, okay, do you know this name? They're connected to this person, and they're like, why do I want to know somebody from 1880? It's a different outlook.
Oh, that's
Yes.
funny. So now, do you have Italians that come to you and ask you if you could find anybody in the United States or in South America?
Very rarely. I mean, we've had it every now and then, but not that often. Because most of the Italians, they know that, okay, I've got a family member that lives in New York, or I've got a family member that lives in Buenos Aires. And it varies, like down south, there are more, especially in Basilicata. It's interesting, Basilicata, when they say Americano, they mean a country from South America. They don't mean the United States, because they are most familiar with people that have moved to South America, which happened, in the past 60, 70 years, where the people that we're generally looking at emigrated before 1924. So there's a difference in what their view is, who's an American and who isn't. So you always have to then explain, I'm from the United States. So they might be looking for a family member from South America, and that becomes a little more difficult because, okay, Spanish or is it Portuguese, because, different languages down there. So we don't get that too often because they generally know where their most recent relatives in the States are located.
Yeah, and my cousin Cinzia Piramalo, she thought because the family was originally from Spain in the 1500s, and it's only one family that has the name. It's a unique name. And she thought she was going to find, when she was looking on Facebook, she was going to find either people from Spain or people from South America. And when we found each other, she was shocked. She was surprised. And only two people from my grandmother's family came to America, and that was my grandmother and her aunt, who came about 10 years before her. So the whole family, and it makes me nuts that have so many cousins there from my dad's mother that I never knew about. They never said anything, and nobody ever. My grandmother was in contact with them, and when we did meet them, um, it was like we knew each other forever. It's hard to explain.
Yes, yes. No, we've had that experience of introducing clients to family members, and we met my wife's third cousin and their family. They brought us in. We see them every now and then, and yeah, it's just like they knew each other, and you've known them forever. It's
Yeah.
definitely a unique experience to have.
Yeah. Well, my dad's first cousins that are still alive. They're in their 90s, but when we went there, they had my parents' wedding photo that my grandmother had sent,
Okay.
or my
Yes.
grandmother's handwriting on the back. And if my godmother, my aunt, my father's sister, or my father was still alive, I'd be shaking them like, why didn't you tell me this? I had to find
Well,
it out for myself.
we find there's, it's people in a certain age group. My age group, I'm in my mid 60s, and people my age group and older are the ones that are now looking for their history, their ancestry. My father knew nothing about his ancestry. It's Germanic. He thought they came from one part of Germany, which that's not where they came from. They came from Slovakia, but they were Germanic background. So World War II and World War One, those are big effects on, how they were distancing themselves from the home country, and especially a lot of immigrants that went to the U.S., they wanted to Americanize themselves. So it's a different outlook on life and a different outlook on what was important.
Right. And there are a small group of people like us that just have that drive. We have to find it out. I always liked history. That was always my best subject. So I kind of, feel that that's some of why I have to find this stuff. And, like your wife, I did the same thing. I started a blog maybe 7 years ago, which was great, but it was one way. So that's why then I
Right.
started, about 5 years ago doing this, because it's so interesting to me to hear everybody else's stories and talk to authors who wrote about Italy, and every once in a while get an Italian on that talks about what it's like over there and things like that. So before we go, if anybody wants to use your service or find your website, where would they go?
Yeah, just myancestralitaly.com. And we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we've got a web page. Um, the other thing, I last year published a book about our experiences and helping people if they wanted to come and visit their ancestral town. So that's a book that actually kind of walks people through the genealogy research, things to do when they want to come and visit, things to help, get the most out of that experience. So, um, we're here, we're available, we're in Italy, we speak the language, we understand the customs. And that's one thing, especially with the records, the Antenati website is great, but not everybody realizes the records available in southern Italy are much different than the records available in the central and northern Italy. So not every record is available for every year across Italy. It really varies. Fortunate with your families from the south, because those records are have not changed since 1806.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And what's the name of the book?
Italian Ancestral Journeys.
Okay, great. And where could people get it?
It's available on Amazon. It's available on paperback and ebook. People that have Apple, you can download it through Apple on an ebook. So there's a lot of different sources. If you just search for uh, Italian Ancestral Journeys, whatever source is best for you.
Okay, that's great. And I'll be sure to put the link out there. Well, Brian,
Appreciate it.
thanks again. I appreciate it. This was
Good.
great information and great to meet you and talk to you. I'm just going to stop the recording. This